thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon. I am going to give you a quick overview so you know what the structure is going to look like. So I'll speak for about 25 minutes. I'll give a bit of context to the problem. I'll then introduce three components of inclusive governance before talking about two vignettes or stories that look at inclusive governance in practice in some cases from the Western Cape, South Africa, and then finish with a discussion conclusion. I think, to me, one of the challenges with a webinar is that you're not all sitting in front of me, you're all sitting at your desks, and it's very easy to get distracted and finish up your email and responses, etc. So I thought if I could just pose sort of two sets of themes for you to think about as I talk, and maybe jot down some questions or comments as we go, so that when it's question time, you have those with you. So the first set of issues is around the challenges with adapting to climate change in the urban context, given where there are levels of high informality and high inequality. And then the second set of issues is around the process. How do we go about co-producing, collaborating, ensuring participation, and importantly, trying to shift power in many of these areas where adaptation needs to occur? So please think about your experience, and either where it's different to what I'm suggesting, or where it supports that, or where you've got another case to add. Then sitting next to me, I have my friend Raymond Mtati, who is from Green Park Informal Settlement. So I'll be talking about Green Park in my presentation. And then Raymond, after we've had a few sort of questions about the cases, Raymond will talk a little bit from his perspective around some of the challenges and opportunities around inclusive governance. And then there will be further discussion with you all. So we all know that climate risk is a concern in cities. So cities have taken slightly longer than rural areas to get the climate adaptation issues on their agendas, but it is increasing rapidly, and we have cities that are involved in many adaptation initiatives. And part of it is because of changing climate risks, but part of it is very much also because of urbanization, the physical reality of surface hardening, which can lead to increased flooding, more infrastructure, and also the fact that there are many people moving to cities who, if they don't have resources, often settle on marginal lands, so are particularly exposed. And in African cities, the reality is that there are high levels of inequality, and that informality is only going to persist. So we need to engage with informality as something that is not going to go away, and something that we need to work with, and actually provides us with many opportunities for innovation. And so the urban poor are particularly exposed and vulnerable to climate change. And so that is a particular focus for this talk today. And of course, there are many other groups who one could focus on as well. And if we sort of broaden out to the international context, there is this call for change. So it's clear that climate adaptation goals need to align with socioeconomic development goals. If we try and look at climate adaptation in isolation, we're not going to get the support we need. And the work of Wise et al. And others working on adaptation pathways is useful in thinking about not only decisions that are made in the adaptation context, but also the broader political, historical context and the values that people have. But equally, sometimes it's very useful not to start with an adaptation to climate change focus and to start with development challenges. What are some of the urgent, pressing development challenges that already have people's attention? And when dealing with those, maybe try and understand how climate comes into that. And in the second case I talk about in terms of the Flow project, we've taken more of that trajectory where we started off with broader development issues. And so there's been growing acknowledgement that transformation is needed. We can't just look at climate risk in isolation. And some authors have argued around addressing climate risk at the larger scale, which is part of transformation. But then another group have really argued for the need for socio-political transformation. If we are going to reduce climate risk and reduce vulnerabilities, we need to also look at inequalities. We need to look at what participation means and how do different experiences and knowledge feed into the solution. And that really is important in the context of wicked problems, where there is no solution. There's no one solution. It's a solution that has to be developed collaboratively. We can't rely on the past ways of working that is expert-driven. And the important thing to acknowledge is that we're likely to have conflicting rationalities. There are going to be different people and different groups who have different priorities, who have different understanding of the problem, and therefore see the situation differently. And that's okay, because we need to work with these conflicting rationalities to get at better responses. And so if we are looking at urban contexts with high level of inequality, the poor communities need to be at the center of change. We can no longer say that we're doing this for the poor. We need to be doing this with the poor, and together we need to be finding solutions that are suitable to all. So I'm suggesting that we need to support inclusive governance for adaptation to climate risk for the urban poor. And in my presentation today, I'm very much focused on local government and the urban poor. And I recognize that one could be looking at other things, one could be looking at NGOs, one could be looking at certain sectors, but that's not the focus of my talk today. And what I also want to acknowledge is the importance of looking both at the formal governance structures and setups and the informal ones, and the need to work with both of these, particularly in the context that we're coming from in South Africa. And so what I'm suggesting is that three components are important contributions to inclusive governance. And I recognize other people might have additional things, but in this case, these three I see as important. So first of all, a longer-term transformation vision is needed, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Secondly, a cross-scalar response that includes the city and the local level actors is needed. And third, we need to surface and re-articulate power imbalances. So what do I mean by these three? A longer-term transformation vision. So if one acknowledges that the socio-political system needs to transform in order to reduce climate vulnerability, it is important that a long-term perspective is taken. And so many cities already have a city vision. So it's useful to work with that, and that's at a city scale with city actors and what they see as important long-term. But that alone is insufficient. The reality is that if you're working with different groups, it's really important to draw on what their personal aspirations are. What are their ideas and hopes and dreams of what the future might entail? And then one needs to bring in the understanding of changing climate risk to this. And I think a lot of the work on well-being is very useful to draw on in terms of the personal aspirations. So people like Derek Armitage have looked at well-being and resilience in the socio-ecological systems. And I had a student, Jamie Davison, who was looking at the importance of understanding well-being for building adaptive capacity. And then on the changing climate risk side, I think the new work that's growing rapidly around climate narratives is very useful as well for this, for supporting a longer-term transformation vision. In this narratives work, it draws very closely on the climate science and what different futures might look like, but also brings in a story that can include the city vision as well as some of the personal aspirations as part of that. And then part of the transformation goal, if you are interested in the socio-political system, is addressing social injustice. And so this really does take quite a normative perspective of trying to change things. And I think that's important to state, that often this transformation goal does have a normative agenda. And then lastly, I think it's very useful to look at some of the work that some of the political scientists have done, where Kate Meager, for example, has been looking at various cases in Africa, and she sees governing from below as transformative. So particularly in areas of limited statehood, where the state is unable to govern effectively, there have been other groups stepping in to govern. And actually, instead of seeing this as a negative thing, we need to start seeing this as a positive thing. So I feel that part of the longer term transformation vision should be understanding how governance can also transform. In terms of the need for a cross-scalar response that includes city and local actors, it's clear that the city level is an important level to focus on. City actors have access to resources and operate at a scale that is critical to services for many different groups in the city, and are able to operate at a high level. But it's clear that they can't do everything alone. They can only manage certain portions of risk, and they need other actors to be involved. And so if the urban poor are the central are central to reduce, if their vulnerability needs to be reduced, it's critical that they are part of the response as well. And so there becomes this cross-scalar engagement that is very important. And interestingly, there are still very few examples of how local government has actively engaged with residents. So Christine Wansler has looked at some cases in Germany of how there has been engagement, but cities are just starting to try and understand what adaptation means for them. And I know from the South African context that cities aren't always, city governments aren't always particularly good at engaging local citizens to understand what their needs and desires are. So it's not surprising that there are few examples. So we need to try and populate this with more examples of where there is that cross-scalar interaction. And then lastly, there is the need to surface and re-articulate power imbalances, because for the urban poor, it's often very hard to get themselves heard at the city level. People don't feel that they have a voice necessarily, or the governance systems that are set up are quite hard to engage with and make it very hard to insert your view and perspective in the current processes. So power really needs to shift. So although participation is important, it's often about power shifting where we need to focus more attention. So yes, participation, collaboration, and there's been a lot of work done on co-production that I think is central to this. But even with those approaches where there is co-production and participation, we need to really ask, has power shifted? And if not, why not? And it is a hard thing to do, and I think we need to bring in experts who are good at doing that kind of work. And that is not generally city officials, and it's not necessarily academics either, but facilitators who can work with the uncomfortable space of what it means to name and work with power differentials is really important if we do want to see a change. And I think Duncan Green's book on how change happens is quite useful in this regard. He's from Oxfam. So I just want to pause there and ask if there are any immediate questions. And if not, if you could maybe write down one thought, one question, one comment about the first bit on inclusive governance. So either what has stood out for you, what you disagree with, or how does it relate to your work? Okay, I can see someone is typing, so I'll just wait and see what that is before, and see if we're going to have a discussion around that before moving on. Okay, so thanks, Alice. Multifaceted problems require multifaceted solutions, including a variety of knowledge types. And I think, although that sounds logical, including a variety of knowledge types is actually quite challenging. So different people come with different understandings of what is important, and we often value things differently. So as a researcher, I need to shift how I see myself and the importance of my knowledge. And that also then relates to the power imbalances or recognizing power as well. Great. So I can see another comment about the difficult space that this is. And maybe later if we can pick that up, because absolutely, as researchers, we're not necessarily trained for that. So what is the new type of training we need? And as teachers, those of us who are engaging with students, do we need to be ensuring that they have a new type of training as well? So let's see Corinne's comment, and then we can move on to the vignettes. Corinne, indeed, it is difficult to identify the leverages of power and how governance can be used to distribute power. Yes, absolutely. So I think part of what I'll argue in the cases is that it's actually in the local cases and the sort of one-on-one interaction and case-based thing that we can identify the leverages more clearly and work with it. But at a city scale, it becomes a very hard thing to do. Great. So Mark's asked, how do you go from inclusive discussions, which are relatively easy, to making inclusive decisions where differences come into conflict? So Mark, maybe if we can come back to that later on, that would be great, because I think that is a challenge. Having a discussion is one thing, but actually making decisions collaboratively is a lot harder. So if I now move on to the vignettes, this presentation is based on a paper that I'm writing that has been submitted as an initial draft, so it's still under review. And in the paper, I have 3 vignettes or stories. And today I'm only going to talk about 2 of them because of time. But in the paper, I start by looking at the Flood and Storms Task Team and Green Park Gravel platforms. Both of these 2 cases are based in the city of Cape Town, both around flooding in Cape Town. And so in terms of context, the informal settlements in Cape Town flood every year. Even this year during the drought with low amounts of rainfall, there will be localized flooding in many of these areas. It's a high water table, often they're near to wetland areas, and flooding is a regular occurrence. And so what happened is that the city of Cape Town recognized the need to respond to the floods in a collaborative way, knowing that different departments work in different ways and have different responses. And so they set up something called the Flood and Storms Task Team, where the different departments would come together during the rainy season to talk about their responses and make sure that there was alignment. But this really is a case where there was not inclusive governance. So there was very limited involvement from the local level in this city process. So although the ward councillors were nominally invited to these Flood and Storms Task Team meetings, they were never there. There was very poor engagement with them, and there was no engagement directly with citizens. But the second case of Green Park is where there was a local leader, who is Raymond, who's sitting next to me, who really drove the process of ensuring the change happened. So what the community really was prioritizing there was electricity, and I'll talk a bit more of how flood risk was reduced as well. And then the third story that I'll talk about is the FLOW program, and that was part of a project that was run through UCT with a collaboration of people that had a very strong implementation focus, and then a engaged scholarship and research component, where there was a large youth leadership component. There was strong municipal support, and a shift in engagement started to happen. And importantly, the Flood and Storms Task Team and the Green Park Gravel platforms were both processes that were ongoing with the city of Cape Town, where myself and other colleagues came in and sort of observed and did research around the process, whereas the FLOW program was one that I was directly involved in setting up, and we were directly involved in implementing. So slightly different nature of the two projects. So let's talk a little bit more about Green Park. Here is a picture of Raymond on the right, and another colleague of mine, David, Jordhus-Leer, and we are in Green Park here, and you can see in the background there are these blocks with a flat platform on top of it. So Green Park is actually located in a nature reserve, in Drift Sands Nature Reserve, which is just next to the airport in Cape Town. And it actually is, large parts of Green Park, informal settlement, are in a wetland area. So people settled in Green Park decades ago, and it was inside the nature reserve. And so there have been a lot of challenges in getting the city to be able to actually work there, because part of the issue was the land needed to be deproclaimed. So moved from the provincial government managing the nature reserve to the city, so that the city could provide more support. But although there's a ward councillor system in South Africa, where as a community member, if you have a problem, you're expected to go to your ward councillor, who is then expected to take it to a higher level, there are a lot of challenges around the system. And Raymond recognized this, and he recognized the importance of getting attention to Green Park. And so he organized a march to Parliament that got the attention of the mayor. And by doing that and getting some of the political support, he then went on to get the mayor to put him in touch with the Human Settlements Department, who then prioritized the area. They came and did a visit. They agreed to work with Raymond. And although Raymond was asking for electricity as a priority, they said that in the wetlands areas, they would not be able to provide electricity if there was such a high flood risk. So they must first reduce the flood risk. And so the engineering department of informal settlements had built some of these gravel platforms in some other settlements, and said that they would come and put in these gravel platforms. So they put in 4 gravel platforms in 2015, and in the background you can see here how people have erected their shacks on the platforms. Unfortunately, the platforms are made of a very dense composite material, which means that when it does rain, the rain doesn't really seep into them, which is part of the idea. They're supposed to be at an angle so that the rain runs off them. But because these platforms were bigger than some of the other ones, the rain actually ponded around some of the shacks. And so even during flood events, people still have some issues with flooding as well. And then here is a picture just of what they called the relocation area, where people could move to while the platforms were being built. And you can see on the left of the picture that sort of spreads into the wetland area. So the flow program is quite difficult to explain in a few minutes, as it is a very complicated program with many parts. But I'll try and give you a sense of it here. It was very much a transdisciplinary process in nature. We had different academics. We worked with people from the local community and the local municipality who were part of the team. And our theory of change was very much around trying to build the agency of a group of unemployed youth who we called the Flow Ambassadors, strengthen social cohesion between the community and between the residents and the local municipality, and then what we called builds connection to life support systems. And when we talked about life support systems, we were talking both about the environmental resources as well as the money system as a life support system. So on the left here, you can see the ambassadors with some of the team and the municipal manager there at the right, at the far right, and the mayor of Piketberg, which is a small town about 150 kilometers outside of Cape Town. And so the ambassadors, there have been 3 cohorts of ambassadors in Piketberg. The first cohort had a longer program that lasted for a year. And they went through, they were part of this team, and they were in the Flow office daily for a year, and had a very flexible program that we kept changing, but very responsive to what their needs were. So interestingly, our first engagement with Berg River was around climate change adaptation. There were a number of us who helped support their climate change adaptation plan, and a number from UCT and the ACDI, the African Climate and Development Initiative, who were part of a transdisciplinary process. And although we started with a climate change focus, when we started to work with this group of youth, we realized that actually climate change was not their primary concern at all, and that there was a lot of other work that needed to be done around building their generic capacity rather than their specific capacity to reduce climate risk. And so there were many wonderful elements to their program, one of which included a lot of focus on what we called insight, making visible the invisible. So both with the environmental services in the area, where they drew maps, they built models, they mapped the area, but a lot of storytelling. So you can see on the top right there somebody with a camera, which is a mobile phone with the video component, and they learned to make movies, and they were called Mojos, mobile journalists, and they made fantastic movies about local entrepreneurs, as well as things that the municipality was doing. So the other strength of the project was the engagement with the municipality. The municipality got money from what is called the EPWP program, the Extended Public Works program, to actually help fund the stipends of the ambassadors. And so the municipality was very invested in this. They saw it as part of what they were doing and meeting their goals. And then the ambassadors made this wonderful movie on the wastewater treatment works. And at the IDP meeting, the Integrated Development Planning meeting, the ambassadors' movie was shown as to what the municipality is doing around wastewater treatment. So the ambassadors were so happy to have their movie shown. The people who are the sort of broader public at the meeting could see what the municipality was doing around wastewater treatment works. And this relationship was really built with a different understanding of what it means to be engaged with the municipality, where before they'd had a lot of challenge getting the voice of the youth into their planning processes. And so one of the things that came out of this was that really the individual agency of the ambassadors was really strengthened. The quote at the top of the slide is just from one of the Flow ambassadors, who said, "What I learned is that you can do anything if you put your mind to it." And they also really got a sense of being listened to. So some of the power issues did start to shift in the sense that they felt that they were heard. The municipal manager, her quote is at the bottom. She said, "I've been doing social development for 20 years, and I can tell you this is the first program I have seen that can really constitute well-being in a community." So the municipality really understood the multifaceted approach we were taking. There's a journal paper that was written on it about moving from adaptive to transformative capacity. But what I really suggest you look at is the book that was produced. We were very lucky to get some extra funding where we could document this amazing work in a book with local journalists and photographers capturing it. And it's at the site flowafrica.org. So if we then move to look at the vignettes and inclusive governance in conversation, what do we see? So as I said earlier, the first vignette that I haven't talked about, the Flood and Storms Task Team, really didn't have many of the elements of inclusive governance. But Green Park Informal Settlement, where the gravel platforms were built, I think starts to speak to some of the elements of inclusive governance. So for the community's perspective, part of their long-term vision was access to electricity to improve their livelihoods. But also what I see as very important in this case is Raymond's role, where individual power was exercised. He was able to use his personal networks. The people in the city loved the fact that they could call Raymond and he was somebody they could work with directly, whereas often in many informal settlements there's a lot of challenges around politics and who to contact in a settlement. So there really was an extent of cross-scalar negotiation between Raymond and Green Park settlement and the city. Unfortunately, there wasn't a very strong process of engaging the community more broadly. There was a committee, but it wasn't like the city really gave them the option to say, these are many of the different options, or how should we do this in many ways. So they had some input, but it could have been a more engaging process, and that issue of power could have been more strongly addressed. The flow program, I would say, meets more of those elements of inclusive governance. A transformative vision was very much part of the process. So we had this group, and part of my experience has been that to do transdisciplinary work well, it actually helps when you have a smaller group. So there was probably a core group of about 10 of us in the flow program, and so we got to know each other very well, we worked very closely, and that allowed us to work together in developing a vision that was constantly changing. So it was a very agile, iterative program where we would often reflect as a team, and there was opportunity for engagement from all sides. The fact that we had a willing municipality made a huge difference, and you don't always get that. But it meant that there really was this cross-scalar interaction between the municipality and the ambassadors who were from a relatively poor settlement in the city. And so that those relationships were really strengthened. And what really did start to happen was this power shift, partly because of the support the ambassadors got in terms of believing in themselves. They practiced being leaders for the team. They said things in the municipal chambers. They gave presentations. And after their year of doing that, they really felt that they could see the world differently and could share things in a way that they hadn't before, which is an important part of the inclusive governance process. And so in terms of the findings, I think what is important to look at is that leadership really emerged as a very important part of these two stories where there was more success. So I haven't spoken much about Ian's role in the Flow project, but Ian was the coordinator of the Flow ambassadors, and he really led that group, and he was sort of an intermediary in terms of going between the ambassadors and the municipality, although the municipality did engage directly with the ambassadors as well. But his leadership meant that he was able to be very much part of the bigger team and work with us very closely, as well as understand what was happening at the local level and being able to talk the same language as the municipal officials. And I think what is interesting to look at is that actions from individuals can often start to shift the system more than formal processes. So although it might be really important to find processes where there's participation, co-production, together we do this, often it's in these more informal spaces that things really start to shift. And so Raymond worked on his personal relationships between city officials, and that was what allowed him to take things further. It wasn't like there was a formal, if he had only relied on the city's formal process, Green Park wouldn't be where it is today. And so I think part of what we need to do is acknowledge the tensions between informal and formal governance systems and across scales. But I think what we can also see is these informal systems give us a lot of opportunities. And what we're seeing is we need new modes of governance. And so in the informal space, sometimes it's easier to innovate and explore. And that's what we have to try and venture into rather than trying to figure out what the right solution is before we engage. And not surprisingly, I think we know that the urban poor understand the local context best. And how do we find ways to really value their knowledge and bring that into city level processes without it being one where there are power dynamics that mean it's quite hard to really, for them to feel that their perspective has been heard. So in conclusion, I think that these three elements of inclusive governance do help us to support opportunities for climate adaptation that can include social transformation. But I just want to end with this last slide that recognizes that it is very challenging to implement. So I think what's nice about stories is they tell how things happened in practice, and these two vignettes show the change is happening, and we all know the change is happening in many places. From my experience, I can see that at a small scale, it's easier than at a large scale. So at the Green Park kind of case, where there's one sort of smallish informal settlement, they were enabled to engage with the city. In Bergrivier, they're a relatively small municipality, And it's much easier dealing with them as a whole than with the city of Cape Town, that is quite a complex beast to try and understand. But what I'd like to argue is that it's very important to support initiatives, people, and learning. And how can we provide spaces for building the capacity, not just of having a capacity building workshop where it's a certain kind of training and people come for 2 days, but really support the leaders, the learners, the youth to fill these places and start to be the ones making change on the ground. And I think the flow case really spoke to the importance of intermediaries. Sometimes what I've seen in the engagement directly between municipalities or cities and people in informal settlements is that people from informal settlements know that they can expect things from the municipality or the city government. And so already it becomes this unequal relationship, where sometimes intermediaries can come in and facilitate this process to try and put people on a more even platform, which I think is very important. And then the last point is just that if we really do want to support the Sustainable Development Goals, this type of approach helps us to address climate action and sustainable cities and communities. And of course, the social justice angle that comes through in many of the SDGs is there. I think addressing inequality is something that has been a challenge for centuries. So it's not that this is going to do that, but if we can be aware of that and try and see where we can contribute to it, that is very important. So in the presentation, I've just put some of the references to the Venire cases in case anybody's interested in further information for following up. So thank you very much. And let's have a bit of discussion for 5 minutes. Hopefully there'll be some questions, and are we going to let people talk and ask questions? Great. So you can raise your hand and then Eve will give you access to the microphone. So it would be lovely if we could have some actual discussion where we can hear some of you. Otherwise, if you can't do that, please make a comment. And then we'll also ask Raymond to speak a bit after we've had a bit of discussion following directly from this. Thanks. Corinne, I think you can talk now. Can I push enable microphone? Corinne, are you talking? Claire, should we let Claire try and talk? Sorry, Mike, it's not working. Okay, well, please type your question then. Comment. Great. The question of scalability. How do you go from regional work to infer large-scale patterns? I think that's really hard. And I think part of what we've got to do is get right the local scale stuff. So if in every city and town, there are experiments and innovations in multiple local locations, I think that's where we're going to learn and that's where we need to share. So obviously scalability is a concern, and I think that's really important. But I think with this type of work, the value of it is really when it happens at the local level. And I know from the Flow project, we talked a lot about scalability, and there was so much invested in that. It was so much about personal relationships that it was very hard to scale up. So I don't know if anybody else has got some comments or suggestions on the question of scalability and how they think it might be scaled up better. Okay, Alice, I think I've given you the mic. Yes. Alice, you can talk. Maybe, I don't know why it's not enabling other people to talk. Should I mute my microphone? Alice is speaking. We can't hear you. Sorry, Alice, we can't hear you. Do you want to type your question? Do people not have to push the mic button at the top to speak? Oh, guys, if when we give you the mic, if you push the green mic button at the top.
Gina, this is Asher at Signal Centre UVA. Can you hear?
Microphone. That might be what's stopping you.
Okay, hello. Well, it's nice to hear your voice. For people who don't know us, we worked together long ago in Oxford. Yes. So thank you for a really interesting presentation. I was first going to ask about this question of scalability, but Corinne got there first, so I won't repeat that. But my question, well, it was probably an observation and a question in a way, which is that, so, you know, we're sitting here near the east coast of the United Kingdom. You're there in Cape Town. And so that might seem a bit different, but in some ways there's some commonalities. So Norwich, the city that the University of East Anglia is based in, where we're all sitting, so over 50% of people live in social housing, and it's one of the areas where more children get free school dinners than anywhere else, and those are just sort of indicators of a kind of less well-off sort of social exclusion in the UK. And you were talking about some of the communities there. And so, yeah, as somebody who works in engagement around climate change, stakeholder engagement, communication, it's very easy talking to people who've been to universities and sort of the elites, if you like. But it is more difficult to access people who are either in the communities that you're talking about or the communities that we have here around Norwich. So, I mean, how do you go about that? Do you find sort of community leaders and go in that way? In one of your projects, there did seem to be already some governance structures in place around city authorities and town authorities. So how is it that you do manage to kind of access these people, where eventually, like in the Flow program, you had people who were just young citizens who became engaged? Yes.
Okay, for some reason it cut out partway through that. So, but from what I heard at the end there, you're asking, how does one actually, in a way, initiate this process? Where's your initial entry point? So, I think that is a very good question, and I think there is no easy answer, because I know from experience that sometimes you might want to get something done and you are literally sent from pillar to post. Nobody can tell you who the right person is. And I guess that's why I talked about this importance of personal relationships. So obviously you need an initial entry point, but once there is an initial entry point and engagement, if you have somebody who you can go to and speak to and know that that person knows the governance system, they can often help you. So that's why I just find the smaller systems easier. We were able to go to a small municipality and very quickly we could learn who were the important people to engage with and who could help us and what capacity they had. For example, we were working on environmental related issues and they didn't have anybody who did environmental related issues more broadly, but they had a strategic manager and she was very interested in environmental issues. So she was very happy to work with us and saw it as a benefit. In the city of Cape Town, it's a lot more challenging, and maybe that's somewhere where Raymond comes in, but equally from what I've told of his story, he got attention in another way, and through getting attention from the mayor's office, she then put him in touch with some of the right people. And I think that initial entry point is quite important. And I just want to read Sipiwo's comment. I like Ash's question as it highly resonates to the types of challenges I was thinking in terms of the informal settlements in and around Cape Town. And I think that that's part of what I think of in terms of like real capacity building, understanding, well, what are even the different departments in the city of Cape Town? Yes, there's you know, a line that you can phone if there's a problem, but if nobody answers that line or if nobody comes to sort out your query, where do you go from there and how do you know how to navigate that system?
This is Asha again. Thank you, Gina, and please tell me to be quiet. I don't want to necessarily hog the microphone, but this just seems a good opportunity to ask some questions. And I think, my first question was actually going to be about scale, but Corinne, my colleague, got there, so I'm going to almost re-ask the question about scale in relation to, in relation to funders, because funders want to have big impacts rather than local impacts in general. They want to maximize capacity. They want to make the best value of their money. And so, I mean, there must be ways that we can, scale lessons from the very local to the regional or bigger. And so is the way, or one way to do that, you asked for suggestions, to try and do some sort of similar process with some of the elite, some of the people who have power themselves. Now, it's not going to be around the drainage systems in their settlements, for example, but to actually still try to bring the main parts of the actual process, even though the outcomes will be different, to engage those people so that they can actually see the process and the difference that it makes. I know that that's not easy because these people have jobs and they're busy, but to try and involve the elites in these smaller scale developments might be one way of trying to extrapolate out, because it's the elites that have the power and more influence over a larger area. That's just a thought.
Great, thanks. I think it's a very useful thought, and I think it is a way to do it. And I think that some of what we've seen is once the elites get the issue, then they're more likely to sort of support and drive change. So I think there has not been enough done, particularly in Southern Africa, around engaging with politicians around climate change. They don't necessarily see it as something that's important for getting votes. So if we can work more closely with the elites, with politicians, and get them to shift, that will help a lot. And also getting these elites into some of these cases and stories will give them a personal experience of it, which is when they will then start to support it, when they've seen that story and how it works in action. So what I'd love to do now is hand over to Raymond, who can speak for a bit about his experience and some of his thoughts on this issue. Raymond?
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much, Gina. I think it's very much an informative talk, this one. I'm very much happy and seeing that we are not only as community leaders trying to make a difference. There are people also who are trying to engage on a academic kind of level. It is very important that what I've observed as far as in our case in Green Park, that capacitating the community leaders, because we are only depending on the ward councillors, of which it becomes there's a lot of red herring there. You find that there's politicking there, and then whereas you as a community leader are faced with challenges of having to be a social worker, of having to be a guide to various factors. So it therefore becomes very important that the capacity of the leadership is paramount. Also, I'm going to put also as the second issue that is important for me is as far as women involvement in Green Park. It has actually very much assisted me a great deal, because women were very slow in getting to acquaint ourselves with the challenges that we are facing. So women, they have that sixth sense, in so much that in Green Park, as far as climate change is concerned, I decided that it's very important that I must make it possible that women are given a center stage, of which gender CC was very much helpful.
So that's an NGO in Cape Town, Gender CC, yeah.
Yes.
Gender Climate Change, I think it stands for.
Yes, which is a program which is funded by the European Union through Oxfam. It was very much instrumental in terms of making it possible that women were having these kinds of tunnels to store water. There was also programs of like solar system. The interesting part was that this thing was able to be effected in terms of we're using the gender CC finds us with a community ward that was in a dilapidated condition, and we were able to use that wall in terms of instilling the urgency of the matter of climate change for us to adapt. How can we adapt to the climate change? And then that wall was having I forget now. It's a gas.
The biogas.
The biogas. Yes. There was a biogas. There was tunnels, which were very much also helpful. But I think also, as far as the city is concerned, it has been very much challenging, of which I would say it was very much important that to the policies of the city, they need to put human factor into them. Because you find out that there's always this policy which is thrown to people, of which it needs to have a human factor into it.
Great. So is there a last question or two for Raymond? Because I know we need to wrap up in the next 4 minutes. Thanks, Raymond. I think that's really useful and interesting, and providing support and training for the community leaders who often, have to currently go through the ward councillors, but if they had their own sort of support and training, that would be a really useful thing. And I think the woman thing is really, really important as well. Thank you. Mark New, yes. Okay, Mark, you should be able to speak if you took your green mic. So a nice comment here from Tyndall Center, an observation that their work in Bangladesh points at women as the agents of change. Yeah, thanks for that. Interesting. Okay, Mark's mic doesn't seem to be working, but it's typing. Mark, did you tick the green microphone at the top, the arrow to the right of it? There's a bias in our mic. It only accepts UK voices, it seems. Mark, you're still typing. Raymond, is there any experience of learning between communities?
Yes, very much so. In terms of having to be resilient and focus onto the ultimate goal, because knowing fully well that we wouldn't have electricity if we wouldn't address the fact that the wetland issue within the area. So the experience was to actually much over, and then we engage government into the whole thing.
Okay, thanks. I can see the Tyndall group needs to log out.
Hi, okay. So thanks very much to Gina and Raymond for the interesting talks. And then one announcement before you all go. If anyone's interested in the UCT UEA NRF Newton PhD exchange program, the deadline is due by the 15th of October, and that's for exchange next year in 2018. And so you can email your application to kabalochauke@uct.ac.za. I'll type that in the chat box now. So yeah, you can email him the application, or if you have any questions. Great, thanks so much everyone.